Welcome back. We've learned a little bit about testing, but how about testing our React component or our React app, our RoboFriends app? If we take a look at our folder over here, I have the RoboFriends PWA because it's now a progressive web app. And based on what we've learned, we might go to the actions folder, constants folder, maybe the reducers file, not folder, I guess. And because these are just simple functions, we might know how to test them. But the one thing we haven't really discussed is how do we test these functions that are React components? I mean, how do we actually do that? And there are ways that we can figure out to test this with the methods that we've learned so far. But there's a great library that simplifies things for us, and that is Enzyme. And this is a library by Airbnb that is pretty standard in the React community. If you want to test your components, then you're most likely going to use Enzyme. And Enzyme is, again, a tool that allows us to say, hey, in our tests, just render this car component, and Enzyme is going to give us a ton of methods for us to test, hey, did the div get rendered? Did the image get rendered? Did the name and email get rendered? So in this video, let's install Enzyme and have a look at what it offers us. Now, they have great documentation here, and you can see that based on our React version, they have different things that we need to install. And since we're using React that is higher than 16, if we take a look at package.json, we see that we're using React 16.2. You might be using a higher version of React, but most likely you're going to be using a version that is higher than this. In that case, they give us pretty good information of what to do and what we need to install. So we need to install the Enzyme library, as well as this Enzyme adapter React 16. So just a special adapter that we need for this newer version of React. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. And you see that we're doing -- save dev because it's a dev dependency. All right, we have Enzyme installed with the Enzyme adapter. Now, if you go through their documentation, we need to do a quick setup for us to be able to actually use Enzyme. And again, this is because we're using a newer version of React. And I want you to keep in mind that this isn't actually difficult when you see me have these special cases of libraries and we need to do some sort of a setup. Most of the time, all these libraries have documentation for you to get started. I mean, their goal is for people to use them as much as possible, so they're going to make it easy for you to understand and set up. With Enzyme, what we need to do is create something called a setup tests.js to set this up. So in our source folder, we can just say new file. We'll call it setup tests.js. And within here, we're going to import something called configure from Enzyme. And again, all of this can be found in their documentation, so don't get intimidated by this. I had no idea how to do this until I actually read their documentation. Just on their introduction page, it'll show you how to do this. And then finally, we also want to import something called an adapter. And if I can spell, that's how you spell adapter, from the Enzyme adapter React 16 library that we also installed. And then finally, we just need one single line here, and that is to say configure the adapter to have a new adapter. If you really want to know what this does, you can go through their code on GitHub. But just by looking at the name, we say that it's just configuring our tests. All right, so that's set up. What can we do? How can we actually test our components now with Enzyme? Well, Enzyme gives us mainly just 3 things that we can use. Let me show you what they are. One is something called shallow. The other one, something called mount. And then the third, a render. And these are functions that we can use from the Enzyme library that we just used. And from these 3, we're able to do something really, really interesting with our components. You see, in an ideal world, to do a test, we can render this whole thing and make sure that it returns what we expected. Like I said before, to make sure that we're returning a div, perhaps with these types of class names, that we're also returning another div inside of it with name and email. So just like a DOM, we need to figure out if it renders exactly what it needs. And just by looking at the names, it looks like Enzyme provides for us a way to render, mount, and shallow this component. So what do these all mean? And I'm going to give you a heads up. Most likely, 90% of the time, you want to use shallow. And shallow is what we're going to be using in this course. There are some cases that you might want to use mount and render, but just keep in mind that with Enzyme, we're pretty much just using this, which makes it very, very nice and simple. The very first thing, the one that we're using most, what does shallow do? Well, first off, let's create a test file here because, well, we're not going to import Enzyme in our actual component. So within the components file, I'm just going to say new file, card.test.js. And now let's import Enzyme here, as well as importing our actual component. So again, we're going to import card from the card.js file. And now, let's just for fun, see what happens if I do shallow card or the card component. And let's just console log this. Now, how do we actually run this test? Well, if we go to our package.json, we haven't installed Jest. But remember, because we're using Create React App, this comes built in the React scripts. It has all this stuff set up for us. So we can simply run npm test. And we get a bit of an error here. We say that React is not defined. That's because, remember, we're using JSX here. So we need a way to read JSX. And if you remember, with any component, we always import React from the React package. All right, and it says that our test suite must contain at least one test because we're not really testing anything. But at the bottom here, we see that we have a shallow wrapper of length 1. So what does shallow do? Simply by running this syntax, we're saying, hey, shallow render this card component. And shallow rendering is useful because it just renders the card component. If the card component, for some reason, let's say had another component inside of it, that is the hello component, well, it's not going to render that as well. It's just going to shallowly render just this component. And it's useful because it constrains yourself to testing one component at a time, one unit, as you might remember. A unit test is something that just tests one unit at a time, one small piece at a time. And this ensures that your tests aren't indirectly asserting on a behavior of a child component like the hello component. So that's why I'm a big fan of the shallow rendering in Enzyme. Ideally, you just want to test one thing at a time without affecting all the child components. And this keeps your tests nice and clean. Now, the cool thing with Shallow is that we get a ton of methods that we can now use on this card component. For example, now, because we've rendered this, we can use our good old friend expect to say, expect the shallow rendered card component, and then we can say to equal 1, and we'll just give it a length property here. And again, we want to wrap this in our it block, expect to render card component. And now we can just put this inside. Let's save. And there you go. We have one test passing. And this shows that, all right, the card component, when we render it, it's going to actually render something to equal 1. I mean, it's a silly test, but that's nice. We were able to just render nice and simple card component. Let me remove the hello from here. Now, what about these other two? These other two things, we're not going to go into too much because they have their specific use cases. Like I said, most of the time you want to use Shallow and keep your tests nice and simple and contained. But Mount does what's called a full DOM rendering. It's ideal for use cases where you have components that maybe interact with the DOM API. So for some reason, maybe the card component uses .query selector all or any of the DOM APIs that we usually see. Or maybe the card component has some sort of a lifecycle method, a React lifecycle method that you want to test, such as component did mount. Now, one note with the mount is that it requires a full DOM API to actually work and be available for us for the mount to happen. And this means that it has to run in an environment that at least looks like the browser environment. And if you remember from our previous talk, you might not always want to run your tests inside of a browser because, well, it takes a bit of time. So if you don't want to run your tests inside of a browser, you might use something like a headless browser or a JS DOM. And it's recommended that with JS DOM is used with Mount. Keep that in mind. Mount, unlike shallow rendering, does a full render and actually mounts the component on a DOM, just like React does, which means that tests can affect each other if they're all using the same DOM. But like I said, it's very rare that you want to use Mount because it can get complicated and you want to keep your tests as clean and contained as possible. Finally, the last one is the render. And the render function, as the name suggests, is used to render React components, but unlike to a real DOM, it's rendered to a static HTML. So render returns something very similar to what Shallow and Mount does. However, the difference is that render uses a library called Cheerio underneath the hood. Think of it as an in-between Shallow and Mount. It doesn't actually need a full DOM API, but it does render any of the card children underneath it if you need to test those. All right, so we have Enzyme set up and we can test some of our components, but there's still a little bit more work we need to do. So for that one, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.